For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1872,
Clerk,
the reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2018, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1872, a bill to promote access for United States officials, journalists, and other citizens to Tibetan areas of the People's Republic of China and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford, and the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 1872 under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1872, the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2017, addresses an issue of longstanding and increasing concern regarding China's treatment of Tibetans living in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, also known as TAR, and other Tibetan areas controlled by China. In 1950, the Chinese People's Liberation Army went into Tibet in order to establish control over the region. In the years since then, as noted by the U.S. Department of State, the Chinese government has imposed severe restrictions on Tibetans' ability to exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Such restrictions occur with regard to religious practice, freedom of travel, freedom to practice cultural and language preferences, and other aspects of everyday life. In addition, the Chinese government routinely engages in human rights abuses such as extrajudicial killings, torture, and arbitrary arrest. In fact, the Chinese government's actions are so severe that in recent years, over 150 Tibetans have self-immolated in a last-ditch effort to get the rest of the world to focus on this problem. In order to prevent documentation of the religious freedom restrictions and other human rights abuses to the outside world, the government of China has severely limited access by foreign nationals to these Tibetan regions. Such limitations prevent access to U.S. officials seeking diplomatic and consular access, journalists, human rights workers, and even tourists. When rare access is granted, activities are closely monitored by the PRC, and information dissemination is restricted. Matteo Makashi, the president of the International Campaign for Tibet, has stated that the Chinese leadership is seeking to enforce complete isolation of Tibet, often described as being worse than in North Korea, where at least some foreign media are based. Independent international observers are shut out of Tibet or allowed to visit only under strictly controlled circumstances, while numerous delegations of party officials face no obstacles in traveling to Western democracies to spread their propaganda. In fact, travel by Chinese nationals, including those with direct and substantial involvement in the formulation of policies to restrict access to Tibet, is routinely allowed by governments all over the world, including the United States. During fiscal year 2017, for instance, nearly 1.5 million tourist visas were issued by the United States to Chinese nationals, and those visas are valid for 10 years, during which the Chinese nationals can visit the United States multiple times. During that same period, the United States issued nearly 4,500 diplomatic visas to Chinese officials. H.R. 1872 prohibits an individual who is substantially involved in the formulation, execution of policies related to access for foreigners to Tibetan areas from being granted a U.S. visa if the Secretary determines that, 1, the requirement for specific official permission for foreigners to enter the Tibetan Autonomous Regions remains in effect, or 2, such requirement has been replaced by a regulation that has a similar effect and requires foreign travelers to gain a level of permission to enter the Tibet Autonomous Region that is not required for travel to other provinces in China. And 3, restrictions on travel by officials, journalists, and citizens of the United States to areas designated as Tibetan Autonomous in the provinces of Sichuan, Qinghai, Hunan, and Gansu of China are greater than any restrictions on travel by such officials and citizens to areas in such provinces that are not so designated. Any visa currently held by such individuals will be revoked under the bill. The bill then requires the State Department to report annually to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, as well as the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the number of actions taken regarding visas pursuant to this legislation. According to the State Department, in recent years, there have been very small inroads made with regard to access to the Tibetan areas. And while some have expressed the concern that moving this bill could make the Chinese government roll back some of those inroads, moving this bill is the right thing to do. It is time that Congress take a stand with regard to access by foreign nationals to the Tibetan regions. I want to thank Congressman McGovern for his work on this issue, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet bill introduced by my colleague Jim McGovern, who has been working on this issue for such a long time, is our ranking member on the Rules Committee and the co-chair of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. I'd like to thank him for the hard work and the dedication to this issue and on this bill. The Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act is about fairness, human rights, and careful U.S. diplomacy at its core. For too long, China has restricted access to Tibet, preventing U.S. diplomats and journalists from observing human rights abuses in Tibet and preventing Tibetan Americans from visiting their home country. This bill seeks to reset that table. H.R. 1872 is premised on the idea that reciprocity forms the basis of diplomatic law and that the practice of mutual exchanges between countries. This bill simply requires that if Chinese officials, journalists, and other citizens are able to travel freely in the United States, then it's only fair that their American counterparts are also able to do the same. And if Americans are not granted the same access to Tibet that the Chinese enjoy in the United States, then there should be consequences. This is more than reasonable and long overdue. Tibet is so difficult to visit that a Washington Post journalist said in 2016 that Tibet, quote, is harder to visit as a journalist than North Korea, end quote. Mr. Speaker, I had the great honor last year of traveling with our minority leader, Nancy Pelosi, and Congressman McGovern to Dharamsala last year to visit with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was a deeply, deeply moving meeting with him, with the Tibetan government in exile, and the 10,000 plus people that came to a public celebration event while we were there. The world knows that His Holiness is a man of peace and tremendous integrity. He has laid out a 5-year roadmap for negotiations with China, and he's willing to work with China to find a way forward. For any peace plan to get a footing, we have to work closely with our global partners to push this issue at this time, because if His Holiness should die, and he will eventually do so, a period of greater instability is likely to ensure making the human rights issues and the possible solutions still more intractable. The timing of U.S. actions here is extremely important. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from Florida as much time as she may consume.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend, my colleague from Florida for the time. When the Dalai Lama was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in the year 2007, and this was through legislation that I had the privilege of authoring with Tom Lantos, our esteemed late chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the only Holocaust survivor to have served in this body. When we passed that in the House and we had the celebration of the Dalai Lama right down the hall, the plight of the people of Tibet was at the forefront of U.S. policy toward China. But in the years since, as China has gained both in strength and in power, I have grown increasingly worried that Tibet has been pushed to the periphery, to the edges. It's an afterthought. I was worried that China's bullying and intimidation tactics on display throughout the world had extended so far that our United States Congress no longer had the will, no longer had the desire to speak out in support of Tibet. But with this bill, Mr. Speaker, authored by my good friend and my colleague, Congressman Jim McGovern, we are finally reversing that trend. We are sending a clear message, a true signal to the regime in Beijing that the United States has indeed not forgotten about the people of Tibet, that Congress will not accept Beijing's bullying and its intimidation, and that we will stand up in support of human rights for the people of Tibet. From demolishing Buddhist temples to jailing more and more prisoners of conscience, Beijing's policies in Tibet are not only immoral and unjust, but are threatening the stability of a crucial area for U.S. interest. So we must put pressure on China to stop its repression. This bill demonstrates that Tibetan human rights continues to be an important factor in our relations with Beijing, and I encourage all of my colleagues to give Mr. McGovern full support for this bill. Thank you, and I yield back my time to you, sir.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, having no further speakers, we are prepared to close.
The gentlewoman from Washington is prepared to close.
Mr. Speaker, I have an additional speaker. I'm proud to yield as much time as he may consume to my colleague, the sponsor of this bill, a great fighter for human rights, Congressman Jim McGovern.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank my colleague from Washington for yielding me the time and for her leadership on this legislation. And I appreciate it very much. And I'm grateful to my colleagues from Florida as well for their support and their leadership. Mr. Speaker, today is a great day for human rights. The House is about to approve our bipartisan bill, the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, that will impose real consequences for China's bad behavior in Tibet. America's foreign policy ought to send the message that we value human rights, that we stand with those working for freedom, that those values compel us to speak out when we see something that's wrong, and that we will hold accountable those who violate the basic human rights we all are entitled to. And that's exactly what this bill today is all about. The basis of diplomatic law is mutual access and reciprocity. But while Chinese diplomats, journalists, and tourists travel freely within the United States, the government of the People's Republic of China has erected many barriers to travel in areas of China inhabited by ethnic Tibetans. U.S. diplomats, journalists, and tourists must obtain permission to enter the Tibet Autonomous Region, a requirement that does not exist for any other provincial-level entity of China. Visitors also face obstacles to their ability to travel to Tibetan areas outside the TAR. But under this bill, Chinese authorities who are involved in the design and implementation of policies that restrict travel to Tibetan areas become ineligible to receive a visa or be admitted to the United States. This is a victory for human rights of Tibetans and Americans. Restricted access to Tibet has many negative consequences for Tibetans in China and for citizens of the United States. Tibetans are left isolated from the rest of the world. Their well-documented suffering under Chinese rule arbitrary detention, torture, and ill treatment, extensive government surveillance, restrictions on the use of their language and their religious and cultural practices. All these violations of fundamental human rights are hidden from sight. Preventing diplomats, journalists, and tourists from traveling to Tibet makes it much harder to assess the full scope of these abuses. I know firsthand how important access to Tibet is because I had the opportunity to join Leader Pelosi and several other members of Congress for a visit there in November of 2015. I saw the tight control the government exercises over virtually all aspects of the daily lives of Tibetans. And I had people thank me for being there, remembering them, and fighting for their rights. On the other side, China's travel restrictions deny Americans the right to visit one of the most beautiful places on earth and to experience Tibetan culture in all its richness. And in emergencies, Americans may be denied help due to China's restrictive policies. I'm reminded that after an October 2013 bus crash in the TAR, which left 3 Americans dead and many others injured, U.S. consular officers faced a long delay in obtaining permission to travel to the region. This severely hindered their ability to serve American citizens in distress. And following a 2015 earthquake that trapped dozens of U.S. citizens in the TAR, the U.S. Consulate General faced significant challenges in providing emergency consular assistance. This is simply unacceptable. So if China wants its citizens and officials to continue to travel freely in the U.S., Americans, including Tibetan Americans, must be able to travel freely in China, including Tibet, beginning now. This bill will move us in the right direction on this basic but very important issue. Let me also take a moment to recognize several organizations with which I have had the privilege to work with on behalf of the human rights of all Tibetans. I thank Human Rights Watch, the Office of Tibet, Students for a Free Tibet, and most especially the International Campaign on Tibet. Without their commitment and persistence, this bill would not be on the floor today. With this bill, we are taking an important step forward on behalf of the human rights of Tibetans. We are reaffirming our support for the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and we are sending a message to the government of China. Human rights are not negotiable. Supporting human rights is the moral thing to do. It is the right thing to do, and it is the American thing to do for Tibetans in China and everywhere else in the world. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding the time, and I yield the rest of my time back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
We reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the actions called for in this bill are measured and calibrated. Measured in that they follow the line of traditional diplomacy of taking careful steps without the dangers of over-escalation, but calibrated to achieve a real opening, to wisely use U.S. power to open up an opportunity for two sides to take their next steps. There are many Tibetan Americans throughout the United States whose family members still reside within Tibet, and they are watching this chamber closely for signs that the United States is willing to help, willing to allow them to return to visit their families, and hoping fervently for a solution to the pain and suffering in Tibet and with the diaspora that has been experienced by generations. This is a time for bold U.S. leadership, and I do believe that is what this bill offers tonight. Our timely consideration of this bill takes an important step forward in leveling the global playing field. This bill seeks to make simple policy changes to enforce reciprocity between our two countries, to make clear that China cannot bar our people from Tibet, and continue to expect open access to our country, allowing for the freedom of movement for people in both of our nations sets an important precedent going forward. And Mr. Speaker, let me just say that we are waiting for another speaker to come, and let me just say that this has been an incredibly important bipartisan collaboration that we've had, and I'm very grateful to my colleague from Florida for her work on this, and I'm also very grateful to Chairman Goodlatte and to Ranking Member Nadler. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield to our leader, Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, who has been a tireless champion on this issue for decades, has led many of us to meet with His Holiness, has worked with His Holiness to come here, and has been a champion for human rights around the world. I yield the leader a minute.
Thank you so much. I thank the gentlewoman from Washington State from day one has been a champion for human rights in our country and throughout the world. I was proud to travel with her to visit with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, where this issue has been on the forefront for many years and currently. I thank Mr. Holmgren for his leadership and being part of this legislation, and also Chris Smith and Frank Wolf before him. We've been working on this for a long time. On our trip, we called, on a previous trip, we visited Tibet, and we called Mr. McGovern the spiritual leader of our trip because everywhere he went in Tibet and then also in the rest of China, he brought up this issue of reciprocity. It has a human rights aspect to it, but it also is a practical matter that if we want to improve communication and relationships in the West, if the Tibetan, it's the Chinese government, but in the form of the Tibetan local government there wants more people to go to school and visit Tibet and all, as a practical matter, it would be very important for us to have a diplomatic presence in Lhasa. So I rise in support of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. It's a strong bipartisan bill, and that we're very proud of that takes an important step forward to advance the future of freedom, dignity, and prosperity for the Tibetan people. I want to congratulate and now acknowledge the leadership of Congressman Jim McGovern, as I mentioned, who is a co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. 10 years ago, he became the chair of that commission. He's been working on this issue even before then. His leadership honors the legacy of Tom Lantos, our colleague, and the responsibility of Congress to defend human rights and dignity around the world. And that has always been not only bipartisan, but bicameral in this issue. Governor McGovern bill holds Chinese officials accountable for their repressive campaign to end Tibet, to cut Tibet off from America and the world. It promotes free, unfettered travel for American diplomats, journalists, and tourists to Tibet, and fosters strong bonds between our peoples. And it sends a clear signal that Tibet's meddling in Tibet's affairs is unacceptable and cannot continue. For 6 decades, the Tibetan people have stood defiant in the face of oppression and brutality from an authoritarian China. The people of Tibet have courageously spoken out for their freedoms, and the rest of the world has been stirred to action by their clarion call for justice and dignity. All freedom-loving people must continue to speak out until every Tibetan can learn, worship, and live free from persecution and abuse. I might add, sadly, that we would hope that there would be respect for the dignity and the faith of the Uyghurs in China as well. In November 2015, I led a congressional delegation, as I mentioned, the first congressional delegation in a long time to enter Tibet with Congressman McGovern. In Jokhang Temple, Portola Palace, and Sera Monastery, we witnessed the strength of the Tibetan people and the beauty of their culture. Last year, again, I led another bipartisan delegation to Nepal and India, where we were blessed to be received by His Holiness Dalai Lama, and Congresswoman Jayapal was part of that. We had the opportunity to see the aspirations of the Tibetan people firsthand, now living in India, especially in the eyes of the Tibetan school children in Dharamsala. These children are there separated from their parents, but for the most part, because they are not allowed to practice their faith, speak their language, enjoy their culture in Tibet, because that is suppressed. So today, those aspirations remain in peril as China continues to silence the voices crying out for freedom in Tibet and across the region. Every day, Tibetans, Uyghurs, again, the Uyghurs are the Muslims in the western areas of China, and the people of Hong Kong and all throughout China are subjected to the threat of oppression and persecution simply for wishing to practice their faith and pursue a more democratic future. If we don't, Mr. Speaker, if we don't speak out for human rights in China because of our commercial relationship with them, we lose all moral authority to speak out for human rights any place in the world. As members of Congress, we have a responsibility to stand with the Tibetan people as they fight to be free, to practice their faith traditions, speak their language, celebrate their cultures. This bill takes a strong step toward that mission, and I urge my colleagues to join in a strong bipartisan yes on this vote. And again, I want to commend our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have, for a very long time, been such leaders in the issue of human rights throughout the world, including in China, and for whom this particular bill has emerged as one manifestation of where we can make a reasonable, measured difference in our relationship. So I thank Mr. Holmgren and Mr. McGovern for their leadership in bringing this forth. I thank the Judiciary Committee and my colleague who was so important on our trip. It's really a joy to see you on the floor leading this debate. Thank you for bringing your eloquence, your compassion, your concern, your leadership to this important issue. With that, I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields. The gentlewoman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm prepared to close. We have no further speakers, and I would just say that we are incredibly proud to be hopefully passing this legislation tonight with such bipartisan support and reminding the world that the United States stands for human rights. We stand for the human rights of Tibetans, and I thank my colleagues on the other side for their work on this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minority leader for her comments on this issue and strong bipartisan support for human rights, not only in Tibet but all over the globe. And I really, this is a great moment, I think, for this body. So thank you both. And I will repeat again that it is time that Congress take a stand with regard to access by foreign nationals to the Tibetan regions. And again, I want to thank Congressman McGovern for his work on this issue, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1872, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1872 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, the title is amended.